I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the project, which is really ongoing research for me for a long time. In fact, in a moment I'll give you a perspective how long. It last came up when I was working with the Grout Museum, or the Veterans Museum, trying to capture the anti-German sentiment in Iowa at a time when the United States had entered the World War I. It is a topic which is of interest for a variety of reasons. One is I come from that German stock out in west of here by Parkersburg, that I can remember my grandfather talking somewhat bitterly about how badly Germans were treated during the war, or the Great War. And of course I had to stop and think which war he meant when I was that much younger. So it became sort of a piece of kind of a passion of mine over the years to sort of dabble with, dip in and dip out, and then when I came up to 2008 or 2006 with the exhibit, it gave me a chance to do a little bit more. The origins of this project, however, go back 50 years, to a conversation I had with an old family friend, a woman named Ethel Anderson. Ethel grew up lived north of Dyke, you know, the blacktop that goes north out of Dyke. Well, she lived on the west side, which was the German side. Her Anderson was S-O-N at the end. If you were S-E-N, you lived on the other side and you were treated better because you were Danish, not German. Her father actually wasn't German. He was sort of a Scotch-Irish, but her mother was a hardcore German, born in Germany, and they spoke German at our house. Well, Ethel was a good family friend of ours. And in a conversation I had in the mid-60s, she told me about the Great War. She sat down and said, you know, I remember the day I went to school after war had been declared. She was about 12, so she had a sense about the war and what was happening. She said, we went to this country school, and I got into school, and normally we would arrange ourselves and we would stand and we would give the Pledge of Allegiance, the flag would be posted, and then we would sing, and she couldn't quite remember, America the Beautiful, National Star-Spangled Banner, and then the German national anthem of the time, Hail to the Victor's Crown. And that day the teachers told us, sit, please sit down. We're not going to go do that right now. She then told the students, about 15 of them, to take out their readers and open up to page 3. Page 3 was the lyrics of the German national anthem. She said, tear that page out. Well, about this time, the little kids, as Ethel referred to them, are starting to say, teacher, teacher, why are we doing this? I love this page, I love this song. And the teacher, undeterred, had them tear that page out, went around the room, collected the 15 or so copies, took them to the back where the potbelly stove was. She had started a little fire, threw them in, they burned, and she turned around in the class and gave the only explanation that she would give. And she said, there will be no German in this school anymore. And that was that. And Ethel said, you know, it was the beginning of the end of a cultural experience. Looking back at it, you know, 50 years later, it was the end of a cultural experience, of a sense of being somebody, belonging to some group that unraveled over the next 18 months. And as I've sort of gone back through and looked at those events and things that happened, during those 18 months, among other things that happened, she experienced people who changed their name. Being German was not acceptable. You were not Schmidt or Schmitz, you were Smith. You were not Mueller anymore, you were Miller. Towns changed their names. Berlin to Lincoln, Germania to, ooh, forgot that one, North Springs. Menus reflected the new appropriate language. Sauerkraut gone, Liberty cabbage in. Some of them were really pretty silly. Businesses changed their names, and this I found out in another place where I ran across looking for a bank, the German Savings Bank, and of course couldn't find the German Savings Bank after 1919. It had become the, voila, the American Savings Bank. Stores, retailers changed their names to make sure that it did not reflect any sort of Germanic connection. People boycotted pharmaceuticals, although Ethel didn't know that at the time. But she did know that when she went to town, she was sort of an object of ridicule. Farm kids going to town to the big city of Dyke, perhaps that happened anyway, but she would hear the word slacker. What's a slacker? Well, a slacker was somebody who didn't buy Liberty bonds, as we'll see in a minute. It took a long time for her to accept that, one, she really didn't like going to town and didn't do it. Music. Beethoven, Bach, and Wagner gone, American composers in. We'll talk more about this. German church services gone, English in. And that went to the ridiculous situation of even at graveside services for soldiers, soldiers killed in the war who were German could not have that German, or could not have their parents be consoled in German, which of course was their only language. Educators, we'll talk a little bit more about Horst Searle in a moment, but by I think December of that year, the State Board of Instruction said that German would not be taught in schools and that you could not teach German in schools, not only the language but the class itself. Librarians, Ethel realized a couple days later that the 4 or 5 German books on the school shelf in the library, in the school library, were gone. Across the way, there's a note in the paper about July or August that the Waterloo librarian has been asked to remove all the German books from the shelf. And she would proceed, she said, accordingly. I don't know what happened to that, but I know that there's a very good piece of work by Julia Skinner down in Iowa City, who analyzed, I think, 8 or 9 smaller town libraries in German areas, and the librarian in each case, being the gatekeeper in the preservation of knowledge, was forced to find those books and to destroy them. When they did not, people came in and voluntarily helped to do that. Same thing happened in schools. And this, I think, is particularly interesting in how quickly it became acceptable to go to excess to enforce this anti-German sentiment. Schools being as they were, or perhaps I should say school boards being as they were, not liking to spend money that they didn't have to, when told that they should remove German language books from the shelves in the schools, they said, well, yeah, right, we'll look into that. We'll create a committee thinking that maybe this will blow over and therefore we don't have to go back and buy books in 1919, 1920 once this has blown over. What happened was that students came into the schools, the library, the classrooms, found all the books written in German, took them outside and started a very large bonfire. Except in Waterloo, where the people from West High threw them in the Cedar River instead of burning them. I'm not quite sure what that says about West, but it was an attempt, it seemed, to eradicate all vestiges of this German feeling. And finally, let me see, we have one other one. Yes, we'll sort of the transition into Liberty bonds. Ethel remembered her father struggling to find the money, small farmer, 80 acres, I think 40 acres, trying to find the money to purchase his allocation of Liberty bonds. It was a stretch. And for that 2 years, year and a half, 2 years, Ethel said, we lived in a constant state of sadness because we knew that somehow we were bad, we were at least being treated or identified as being bad by the larger society, and there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. So, from that conversation, I had a sort of a head start in the sense of understanding what these problems were. My interest then comes in trying to figure out how that happened. How can students burn books? How can people be arrested for disloyal statements that we'll talk about in a few minutes? How can people be imposed upon to buy Liberty bonds they don't want to buy? And the mechanism for that is what really appeals to me. I can read the stories, but the mechanism of how that happened is sort of what I'll be talking about today. A little context, although looking at the room, I don't think we have to have much context, historical context here, but remember when war breaks out in August of 1914, the British immediately move quickly to win the hearts and minds and guns and ammunition and bank accounts of their American cousins. And that they launched this campaign, propaganda campaign, which turns out to be incredibly effective. Of that campaign, the atrocity campaign, as some people have called it, has turned out to be just terribly effective. And had a terrible impact, as we'll see, on German Americans, particularly those in Iowa. The German was the Hun, and you have this vision of these huge German men, you know, with bayonets, with babies on the ends of it, the rape of Belgium, all these things which were clearly created. Rare exceptions did they have any validity, but the British were able to release that propaganda in a way that very effectively influenced not only newspaper articles or newspaper journalists, any other kind of media, as well as the general public. And as that propaganda became more and more effective, and the United States enters the war in April of 1917, there is in place a very strong animosity towards Germany and towards German tradition. When the United States enters the war, of course, it is only a very small step for George Creel and the Committee on Public Information to expand on that and to keep that drumbeat going, that there is concern about the loyalty of German Americans. In Iowa, that was particularly the case, and the numbers are a little bit vague as to who is German and who is not, but in Iowa in 1915, at the census of 1950, Iowa had a census in the fives. They identified that there were 110 people that were foreign born. They were born outside the country. Of that, the estimate was that 33% of them were German. 33%, 110, 38, 39,000 people, a substantial number of people. Spread across the state roughly along the Mississippi River. Take I-80, Highway 30, Highway 20, backload to the other end, and you have these pockets, these runs of Germans, many of whom never went the route of naturalizing themselves, and of course spoke German in their communities, spoke German in their churches, and were of course speaking German at home. Many of these places were centered around, or many of these groups had enclaves around the church. The Baptist churches and the German Evangelical Lutheran Church, there we go, we got it right, were very tight-knit communities and remained German. I mean, the services were in German. They extolled German culture. They taught their catechisms in German. And as such, when the officials at the state level and at the national level begin to look as to where there might be saboteurs, this was one of the groups that they very quickly identified and began to concentrate on. The attempt on the part of the Department of Treasury, Department of predecessor for the Justice and FBI, but looking at Iowa, they tended to look at the big counties. Scott County, one of the largest. Iowa, Germans started coming there in 1848, fleeing the revolution in Europe. In Sioux County on the other end of the state, far up northwest, as well as where there were pockets of Germans, the Yamanas, Mennonites down in Kelowna, and places like Butler and Grundy County, which had very substantial populations of German as they would come along the railroads and find land and they would settle. This was particularly concerning to officials when it was decided that the United States would be selling Liberty bonds to finance the war. Roughly over the period of a year and a half, they had 5 Liberty bond drives, 4 during the war, 1 after, raised $17 billion, well over 50% of how much it costs to fight the war. And if you didn't raise the money, then you were, of course, jeopardizing the success of the war effort. And so the passage of, or the sale of Liberty bonds was a very major issue. Officials also were looking at any disloyal pockets, people talking badly about the war, people supporting Germany and not the United States, people speaking badly about Wilson. In Iowa, there were probably more than a few of them, but just disloyal statements would somehow undermine the war effort, whether it be in Iowa or wherever. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the sale of Liberty bonds and the disloyal, lack of loyalty or the anti-loyalty statements that were made, trying to identify how this process begins to work. Liberty bonds were sold, and I think the first one was June, then it was September, April, September, and then after the war. The Liberty bond sales were organized by county. They were run by, oftentimes, at least through banks. And the process of figuring out how much people should buy to meet the big quota at the far end turns out to be fairly interesting. The process, and this material comes from a couple of books that were written by, for the State Historical Society, written by people who were involved. The state wants to sell bonds. The bonds are ready to go. How do we convince people to buy the appropriate amount? Well, the procedure works something like this. First of all, people were told the bonds were for sale and voluntarily came in and bought a generous amount. If for some reason, and that amount was recorded, if for some reason you didn't come in, then you might have your employer notified, and your employer might generally say, you know, you might want to think about buying some Liberty bonds. Most Germans were self-employed, although there were quite a few people working in Waterloo at the big factories here. But, you know, let's everybody do our part. When that didn't happen, the process gets a little bit more interesting. The idea was that there had to be sort of a minimum amount of money raised, and that spread across all the districts in the nation. Whatever Iowa district was, I think out of Chicago, you had to have, excuse me, you had to have some dollar amount. And so local committees were formed to determine what the appropriate amount was for each individual family. And my question, of course, is who were these committees to begin with? Well, only in a few cases are they actually their composition even made public, but generally it seemed to be a couple of people. The local banker was always on this committee because, particularly in small towns, the banker knew what their assets were. The local journalist, the man who ran the newspaper, he knew, he was there because he was going to be the way to convey this material, this information. The chief of police or the county sheriff, more the county sheriff than chief of police, because a lot of these places still didn't have police departments. The county sheriff was there, and maybe one of those esteemed senior citizens, maybe an attorney or somebody of that nature, would sit down and they would go through the list of all the people who lived in the community or in the district, and they would say, assets are here, they can afford to pay this, and then it was written down. And somehow, and I don't know I say somehow because I don't know exactly how this was done, that piece of paper, that card, was conveyed to the individual, and you then had a few weeks to pay up, okay? Seems to be 30 days, seemed to be a number that I've heard quite often. It varied from county to county, it varied from city to county. So you get your allocation, and you decide, I can't pay it, I won't pay it, I shouldn't pay it from principle, and therefore, what do? Well, I'm just going to ignore it. Now, you have to know the psyche of German men around the turn of the century, and I know this because that's my heritage. And as my wife says, stubbornness is such a strong feature of German men of that period that it should be written into the prenup before you get married, that the wife needs to know what will be happening and what won't be happening. German men, particularly those who had some Dutch blood in them. The Frieslanders, Ostfrieslanders like myself, were notoriously stubborn. They did not like to be told what to do. When they were told what to do, they usually responded in a very negative way that, at the very least, required a few good choice swear words in German, and or physical violence. I mean, they would fight. So, you are a German, you've been here for maybe 20 years, you still have a very strong feeling for the fatherland or the motherland. You think the Kaiser is okay, although probably your ancestors left not to serve in the Kaiser's army. But there was this affiliation with being German. And now you're being told that you have to give money to the government who's going to send troops to Europe to fight your cousins, your nephews, your whomever, and you don't want to do that. It's a free country. You don't have to do that. Aha! Well, the German found out very quickly that you didn't have a choice, that there were quotas that were enforced. And again, here's my second real interest. How were they enforced? There were these series of extra-legal courts, kangaroo courts if you would, that were created. And the composition of these courts, curiously enough, had a very strong parallel to the people who decided what your allocation was going to be, except that they brought in a local judge as well. So you had a banker, a journalist over here, you had a judge, a sitting judge, a judge who was elected. And that judge, in the case of Black Hawk County, was Judge Platt. That judge would sit in session in an unofficial manner because these courts were not legal. But when you came in to appeal in Waterloo, stories that I've found, you could appeal to the judge and your appeal was written down. There was a bailiff. There was a court reporter. And so these stories were written down. You could make your, I lost money last year, I paid in a different jurisdiction, my daughter's ill, all sorts of reasons, none of which seemed to have very much impact on the court. But you had this opportunity to at least make appeal. If the court turned you down, then they expected funding. You expected your funds, and very shortly. If that was not forthcoming, there was a second step, and that was adverse publicity. What the court would do, since again the newspaper editor's sitting right there, is that the news would get out in the newspaper that the German farmer Hans Schumann has not paid. Hans Schumann has not paid his allocation. And it shows up in the local newspaper. Well, this gets a bit more serious. Public humiliation oftentimes had some impact, but again, remembering my description of character of Germans, it oftentimes did not. So what was the next step? And this is where I think it gets particularly interesting, is that the person would be, firstly he came voluntarily, now he is summoned to this court, this kangaroo court, and is told in so many ways that he must pay. If he doesn't pay, he will be publicly humiliated beyond simply having the fact that he did not pay. And the common one was, widow so-and-so has paid twice her contribution, and farmer Schumann has paid nothing. What is fair? This is America, everybody pays their part. Humiliation had a certain impact. The court, and by the way, the court in Waterloo, and we have finally found this, Black Hawk County War Justice Council, would then do something that was even more extra legal than what they were doing. They would notify interested patriots in the community that these payments were not made and that maybe this person needed a little bit of nudging. And the nudging almost always involved yellow paint. Now, yellow paint has been a side of cowardice or not participating. Start of the war in 1917, the pacifists who were opposed, socialists who were opposed to the war, had their house painted yellow. But in rural Iowa, in Waterloo, the painting of people's homes or facilities all of a sudden start to develop in April, May, June, July, and August of 1917, very early, after that first Liberty Bond is out. The newspapers never gave names of the people, the patriots who were involved in this persuasive tactic. How they learned about these farmers were quite clear. It was passed from that court or that council. But what happened was something like this. If you owed a little bit of money and you seemed to be being fairly close to being persuaded, you got your house, as they use the word, daubed. I think that's a verb we don't use much anymore, but their house was daubed. And I was trying to explain to one of the people at the museum, and they looked at me and with this utter amazement that there is such a word. You daub the fence posts, or the wood fence in front of the house, or the mailbox, or maybe a little bit on the house, or more likely one on the barn. And the next morning when the individual woke up, they found paint, yellow paint, and they knew that they had been outed, if you would, that they were now on the list of the patriots who would conceivably do something more if they didn't respond. Paint, yellow paint, seemed to drive most people back to the War Justice Council with money in hand. There were others who were a bit more reluctant. Either they didn't respond to this first opportunity, or secondly, that they were deeply in arrears of paying for their Liberty Bond subscriptions. And these were people who got the full treatment, which was a yellow barn. You had a whole barn that was painted, not particularly well either. Houses, when that could be done. And I swear to God, this is true, I couldn't find it this last time around. One farmer had his cow painted yellow. Okay, now if you have a yellow cow, you can't sell it. Everybody knows where you're at philosophically on this problem, but so it was. By the time they got to painting houses and they got to painting animals, most people found that it was time to make that concession, and payment was made. This is intimidation. This is destruction of property. And yet, who are you going to go to protest the fact that your property was being painted and destroyed? To the council, who was made up of, or to the chief of police or the county sheriff, who sat in a council who told people to do what just happened. And so for Germans, it was not only a very bitter situation, but it was also an incredibly frustrating situation, because they had come to this country to be involved in the freedoms of saying what you want and doing what you want, and now we're put in a corner where they could not get out. The bond drive tactics, for the most part, worked. And whereas the early two drives, counties like Butler and Grundy, with a lot of German, rural German, were very low in their contributions, by the third, fourth, and fifth drive, they were up with everybody else, in part driven by the new director of the Black Hawk County, who had influence in the other counties, a man named Macy Campbell, who was the professor of rural education at the esteemed Iowa State Teachers College. And he put the licks to the people in the countryside, making sure that they made payment. Mr. Campbell was a very efficient man. So that's one thing I'm looking at, how this process worked, who was selected. I've gone through well over 100 articles in newspapers. Again, I get the incident, I don't get many names, but you start seeing names pop up. You record those names, you see what happened and what their response was. I followed up through the census to find out whether these people left the area after they had been intimidated, and for the most part, everybody stayed. You were German, you stayed here. It was still your country, it was still your area. Second area that used intimidation to make sure that there was support for the war effort was what I call the disloyalty issue. Same council, more emphasis I think now on the county sheriff. By midsummer of 1917, people were starting to report that farmer so-and-so or worker so-and-so was making disloyal statements in the public. Okay, Jack Bruner who was at a movie house in Waterloo and who stood up and said, you know, the Kaiser, the president can go to hell, long live the Kaiser. You know, that got him in trouble, not surprisingly. And so people like this, or even people who would simply make incidental comments like, I just don't like this war. This war is terrible. My family in Germany is being affected. People like this would be, the counting would be made and the reports would be made to the Council of I never remember that word, War Justice Council. Initially, these were handled in much the same way that the non-payment of Liberty bonds. The name came up, the report came up, it was, I don't like the war. The council would fine that individual $10, the money was paid directly to the Red Cross, your name was kept on the list. But as time went on, particularly by November of 1917 and certainly into 1918, there was more and more, there was a trend in a different direction. These councils didn't seem to want to be using their talents, their mechanisms to punish disloyal persons. And so once that report was turned into the council, that name was given to the group of patriots. Some people called them less than that, and the opportunity to dispense justice went from a sort of formal manner, you still had the sheriff or the policeman involved, to a very informal manner. That was a group of men, oftentimes young men, who were told that Farmer Schumann was again talking badly about the American effort, and they would go and they would gain retribution on him. By 1918, this starts to turn into not a $10 fine that goes to the Red Cross. This was confrontation. This was fighting. This was violence. The patriots or the crowd became a mob in many cases, and particularly when there were repeat offenders. And so what you had by 1918 were people, particularly in small towns, on the lookout for specific individuals who were known to be anti-American or pro-German. I can't quantify it yet, but my sense is that by the spring of 1918, this was a primary way to punish people who were disloyal, who were expressing these disloyal comments. And that these groups were becoming more and more willing to resort to violence or destruction of property. They certainly implemented the yellow paint tactic. That was one that worked. But they found that particularly for perhaps repeat offenders, that the beating them up, occasionally tar and feathering, occasionally, oftentimes, hauling around a noose with them, never really having the intent, it seemed, to use them, but having a noose there so just in case, well, let's do it. Actually, only one person was lynched during the anti-German sentiment throughout the country, Prager in Illinois, but the threat of it, intimidation, of course, was something that was always there. There was an incident in Maquoketa in eastern Iowa where two men were stopped. They were hauled to a tree. The noose was brought out. Their wives ran into the crowd screaming, "No, no, no," promptly fainted, and nobody quite knew what to do at that point, so they all sort of left, okay? So the tactic was, if you're in trouble, have your wife come and bail you out. And by after, and we'll talk about it just in a moment, after the Babel, the proclamation, English only, that violence, that intensity starts to accelerate. So you have two situations here where extra-legal courts, and sometimes through extra-legal groups, are imposing justice on people who are simply expressing their views. How was that accepted? How was that received in the rest of the community? If there were people who were opposed, they were very, very silent. The The numbers are difficult to estimate, but the bond people said 99% of the people paid happily and on time. Well, 1% still adds to a pretty substantial amount. There were people in the community who stepped forward to try to mitigate this violence. The ministers, particularly ministers in the German evangelical church, were ones who would try to defend their flock, trying to make sure that that they were not become the target of a lot of anti-German sentiment. This was particularly difficult after May of 1918, when Governor William Harding declares proclamation, executive decree, that English is the only language in the state of Iowa. Public discourse is English only if you speak any other language, and that included Danish, and it certainly raised a lot of hackles in this community. But if you spoke any other language, you were violating the law. The German evangelical church and the Baptist church, a lot of people were still giving at least every one occasional sermons, as well as grade-sized services, in German, and they were teaching their catechisms in German. And so pastors stepped forward and tried to sort of blunt that attack and to provide some sort of immunity for their crowd. In one case in Pomeroy out in western Iowa, the minister spoke out very articulately about it and promptly was brought before not one of the unofficial councils, but the legal system now, because now it's a violation of the Iowa law, and ended up being spending 3 years in jail in a federal, not a federal, had to be a state, but spending 3 years in jail. Whether it was ministers, whether it was, there were other folks who tried to intercede, they were not very successful. There were, and I always like this, I don't know those of you who know Lanny Haldy down at the Amana Museum tells the story. There were ways around it, and this is worth telling. It was in the Amana College, of course, you couldn't use, and they were German speaking exclusively, you couldn't deliver your sermon or your liturgy in German. But they read the law very carefully, and so they came up with a solution. They would file into the house where they were having services. Everybody would sit down. Person in charge of the service for the day would stand, perhaps take the Bible and start to read, or he didn't, but the process of how he would read the scripture for the day. Everybody would stand up. There would be 5 minutes of silence, because that's usually how long it took to read the scripture. He would sit down, close his Bible, sit down. Somebody else would stand up and do some other part of the service. Again, no sound, no voice, no audio. And then everybody would sit down, and then the choir master would stand up, and he would have everybody stand, and they sang. Because you could not speak German, but you could sing German. And so they lustily would sing hymns for more than a few minutes, sit down, sit there for 20 minutes or however long the sermon might go, a couple more hymns, and they would go home. Lanny swears it's true, and I don't question him at all. The most prominent violation of the Babel Proclamation was when 4 elderly women were found to be speaking German on a party line in Scott County down outside of Davenport. They were arrested, taken to court, fined $200 or something like that, and sent home. But it said you cannot speak German in public, and that was a public medium. And by the way, Governor Harding, it's good to know, Nancy Durr, who now teaches at Maryland, was really one of the first persons to do some sort of systematic research on this subject. She did the William Harding biographic sketch in the State Historical Society volume, and she said he was, like all Iowa governors, interested in a higher position beyond being governor of Iowa, and so he was starting to go around to other states to meet with people about perhaps getting the 1920 Republican nomination for the presidency. Unfortunately, in raising money, he took $5,000 from somebody who wanted his son paroled from jail, and Harding did it. He gave him the parole. He was exposed, and Mr. Harding spent the last 12 years not running, not involved in politics. We mentioned President Searly. He made a real effort to insulate the university or the college from this. He was no more successful than anybody else. The German books, Jerry, are there any German books left in the special collections from that period? I don't know. There are. Okay. Then he was somewhat successful. Okay. But I mean, the idea was they came in, they told the books were to be removed from the shelf. Students went out, complied. Students volunteered, went out, burned them. He tried to distinguish between books written in German who were owned by the college and those who were owned privately. That didn't work. He tried to continue teaching German in the, I think it was Romance languages at the time. That didn't work, and eventually I think it fell on hard times, came back in the 20s or 30s, but again, he fought the good fight without a lot of success. As I said, the Department of Public Instruction weighed in. German no longer possible in the school systems, and librarians as well hoped to make some difference, but could not. It's a time when, as you think about groups like well, the Know-Nothings, the American Protective Association, all the other groups, or the Klan who came right after that, coming in and trying to influence what rights are, trying to undercut or undermine the rights, legal rights of people who were Americans, although some of the Germans, I said, were not naturalized, all terribly unsuccessful. Why in this 8-month period did this group of people, in an unofficial capacity, why were they so successful? And so as I go along, moving forward, I'm trying to sort of get an answer to that. Sometimes better lucky than good. I just learned a few days ago that the records for the unofficial council for Black Hawk County have been found. They exist. I am not at liberty to tell you where they are because somebody's going to go and get them too soon. The Church of Latter-day Saints is going to scan them, put them in some sort of public format. By being able to get the county records, I got a city story, I've got a rural story, and I should be able to identify who these people are, how they are involved, and maybe who some of those unofficial enforcers are. That's really what I'm interested in. Do a lot of work on Ancestry, trying again to find out, did people stay after they had been revealed as being anti-American? And the answer thus far seems to be they did. They stayed. They remained in Iowa. Trying to find out how, and by the way, the allocation when the committee sat down and tried to figure out how much you were to pay, generally speaking, it was 2% of your net assets. Well, 2% of $50,000 if you were a successful businessman was one thing. 2% of a 40-acre farm worth much, much less was something else, and that's certainly what Ethel Anderson's father struggled with. So we'll be able to compare that with, you know, maybe looking at Waterloo. I mean, this is a great story that talks about the industrial workers in Waterloo and how that fit into the situation as well. Finally, again, it is kind of answering a promise that I made to Ethel 50 years ago that, yeah, that looks interesting. I really need to find out about that. And thanks to Jess, I have an opportunity perhaps. But such a volatile time in the country's history, certainly the state's history, and to begin to bring some answers to that.